In October 1981, the familiar and measured routine of a quiet American suburb in Arlington, Virginia, was finally and irrevocably shattered by a silence that proved louder than any explosion. Donaldovich Maclean, whom neighbors knew as a dedicated international logistics analyst, stepped onto his porch to collect the morning edition of the Washington Post and never returned. An untouched cup of coffee remained on the kitchen table, and the engine of the family station wagon cooled slowly in the garage. Neighbors saw only an ordinary middle-aged man, but the Federal Bureau of Investigation already understood that an agent codenamed Homer had slipped away from their late and lingering surveillance. According to declassified data from the Committee for State Security, the man the entire neighborhood knew as Donald was born in 1938 in Leningrad and given the name Mark Petrovich Fraser at birth. His biography was nearly a gold standard for the personnel officers in Yasenevo. As the son of a Scottish communist who had once fled to the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics in search of justice, Mark possessed from early childhood an innate lack of an accent, and that specific type of appearance that forensic experts call an eraser face. He was unremarkable in the best sense of the word, representing the type of person people see every day in an elevator, but cannot describe to a sketch artist even 5 minutes after the encounter. The training of Mark Petrovich Fraser at the Special Training Center of the Committee for State Security near Leningrad lasted more than 5 years. Instructors sought not just to teach him the language, but to completely reformate his consciousness to fit the cultural codes of the United States of America. One key exercise Mark underwent in his 3rd year of training was so-called psychological desensitization under pressure. He was placed in a meticulously reconstructed environment of an American police station and subjected to continuous interrogation for 36 hours. He was forbidden to sleep while interrogators using exclusively American slang and psychological tricks tried to force him to utter at least one Russian word or make a gesture characteristic of a Soviet person. Another important lesson was the art of placing and retrieving dead drops in an urban environment. Mark had to spend hours wandering through a specially built training ground, mimicking a Western city carrying an ordinary grocery bag. His task was to attach a magnetic container to the bottom of a bench or mailbox in a fraction of a second, with literally a flick of his little finger so that none of the dozens of hidden surveillance cameras would record it. Fraser's ideological conviction was absolute for him. The surrounding Western world was not a home or a place to live, but exclusively a hostile operational space. In 1965, citizen Donald Maclean officially entered the United States of America through the so-called Black Gate on the border with Mexico. The infiltration became a classic example of creating deep cover where every detail of the biography worked toward the overall goal. Maclean never sought career heights that might attract unnecessary attention from the intelligence services. He methodically and cold-bloodedly built the facade of a respectable American citizen. His daily life was subject to strict masking discipline. First, he became an active member of the local garden club, spending every weekend discussing rose varieties and fertilizers with retired military men and middle-level officials. This gave him a legal excuse to spend a lot of time outdoors and study the suburban landscape. Second, he regularly visited the same dentist downtown every 3 months, which allowed him to have an ironclad alibi for trips to areas where clandestine communication points were located. Third, Donald volunteered at his son's school library, which finally cemented his reputation as an ideal family man and a responsible member of society. However, behind this facade lay a colossal internal tension that sometimes broke through in rare moments of family privacy. Investigators later established the content of one such conversation based on the testimony of his wife, Susan. One evening in 1978, as they sat on the porch, Susan noticed his strange, frozen gaze directed somewhere into the distance beyond their well-kept garden. She asked him what he was thinking about and whether he regretted choosing such a quiet and perhaps boring life. Mark, for a moment forgetting the role of Donald, replied that sometimes silence seemed to him the most expensive thing in the world, but the price for it might turn out to be unbearable for all of them. Susan did not understand the meaning of these words at the time, taking them for the usual fatigue of an office worker. She hugged him, and Mark felt a break within him. The love he was obliged only to imitate according to the instructions of the center began to become frighteningly real, entering into conflict with his true mission. The methods of gathering and transmitting information used by Homer were characterized by exceptional pedantry and caution. His specialty was the logistics of moving military cargo through the civilian ports of the East Coast of the United States of America. One of the most complex operations for transmitting information took place in the spring of 1980. Preparation began a week in advance. Mark spent several nights in the basement of his house using a miniature Minox camera to photograph hundreds of pages of documents regarding shipping schedules for the Department of Defense. He packed the resulting film into a special container disguised as an old discarded pack of cigarettes. The route to the drop-off point was convoluted and took more than 5 hours. He changed 3 buses and 2 taxis, constantly checking for a possible tail through reflections in shop windows and using the technique of sudden stops just before the subway doors closed. The end point was a deserted park on the outskirts of Washington. There, in the base of an old, long, out-of-order telephone booth, was a pre-prepared dead drop. Before leaving the container, Mark made a brush contact with his handler from the embassy, who posed as a middle-ranking diplomat. They collided on a narrow park path. The handler uttered a code phrase about how the weather this year promised to be too dry for growing azaleas, to which Mark replied with a prearranged password about the need to install new automatic irrigation systems. After a short exchange of remarks, which from the outside looked like a casual conversation between 2 gardening enthusiasts, the container was unnoticeably transferred into the handler's coat pocket. The collapse of all the years of work came because of an absurd technical error that had nothing to do with the professionalism of the agent himself. While attempting to place another container in the support of a bridge over the Potomac River, Mark used a magnetic holder that, due to hidden metal corrosion, did not hold on the beam and slipped down onto the pedestrian path. By tragic coincidence, the container was found by a passerby who happened to be a vigilant Coast Guard employee. Inside were microfilms containing data that Federal Bureau of Investigation experts were able to match with information leaks from the Department of Transportation. Investigators later established that the alarm signal was given through a prearranged sign in the window of an apartment in downtown Washington, which Mark drove past every day on his way to work. Seeing the red lamp in the window, he realized that his life as Donald Maclean had come to an end. In his head at that moment, a painful process of choice was taking place. He understood that if he went home and tried to take his wife and children, the chances of their joint escape would be 0, and they would all end up behind bars. Ideological duty and professional survival instinct dictated the only way out and immediate disappearance alone. The evacuation route was planned in advance for the worst-case scenario. Mark abandoned his car in a shopping mall parking lot and boarded an intercity bus bound for Philadelphia. From there, using one of several spare passports, he reached Miami, where he boarded a private flight to Mexico City. Every kilometer of the way, he felt like a physical loss, realizing that he would never see his sons again or hear Susan's voice. From Mexico, a complex flight followed through Havana, where he was met by representatives of friendly intelligence, and only after 4 days of an exhausting journey did he finally land at a military airfield near Moscow. He was greeted as a hero, but for Mark Petrovich Fraser himself, it was the beginning of a long period of psychological decompression. The final stage of his life was spent in Moscow in a 2-room apartment on the Frunzenskaya embankment. He received a personal pension of a colonel of the Committee for State Security, and sometimes gave lectures to young cadets about methods of field work. His American family remained in complete ignorance of his true fate for decades. Susan Maclean remained convinced until the end of her days that her husband had been the victim of a random crime or kidnapping. She never remarried, remaining faithful to a man she never actually knew. For his children, their father remained a ghost who simply vanished, leaving behind only a bitter sense of betrayal and endless unanswered questions. The question that remained unanswered even after his personal diaries from the Moscow period were found in the archives was the true motivation for his choice. What actually won in that last minute in Arlington? The unwavering loyalty to ideology and the oath or the cold calculation of a professional for whom human attachments were only an annoying hindrance in the fulfillment of a state task. Was he a man who sacrificed personal happiness for a great goal, or did he simply become the ultimate victim of a system that taught him to imitate love so skillfully that in the end he himself ceased to distinguish truth from the legend? The echo of his disappearance continued to resonate in the lives of his family for many years, a reminder that in the war of shadows, the most vulnerable are always those who did not even suspect their participation in it. The abyss between Mark Fraser and Donald Maclean was never bridged, leaving behind only a dry chronicle of professional achievements and the shattered lives of people who loved a man who never existed in reality. The final price of his activity was measured not by the number of transmitted microfilms, but by the depth of the void he left in the hearts of his loved ones when he once again chose the interests of the service above the interests of those who called him husband and father. This story remains one of the darkest testimonies of how ideology can completely consume a human personality, turning it into a perfect but absolutely lonely tool in the hands of the state. Would you like me to analyze a specific aspect of his training or psychological state during his years in Moscow in more detail?